Welcome to the Combat Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Peacock. My guest today is Ben from Redbeard Combatives, a second-degree black belt in BJJ in the Carlson Gracie lineage, and an experienced trainer for both the U.S. government and private security sectors. In this episode, Ben draws on his 15-plus years conducting trainings to reveal the weaknesses of what's often called real-world experience, and how proper training environments can fill in the gaps there. This episode is challenging to conventional wisdom in the reality-based self-defense and military combatives world. But listen to his points carefully. So if you're excited to dive in, hit the subscribe button on your podcatcher now. So what I wanted to have you on for, I think we already discussed this a little bit, was basically to talk about some interesting ideas you had about the amount of training hours that kind of go in between somebody who is a civilian instructor versus somebody who is maybe a military or police instructor who doesn't have a whole ton of martial arts experience, which I'm guessing is kind of average for a combatives instructor.
Right.
I could be wrong about that, but yeah, basically that's what I'd like to talk about.
Well, I mean, just to kind of clarify, it's not so much the instructors that you're really gonna have the disparity in experience. It's going to be the actual end users. The instructors themselves, a lot of them, at least on the military side, they do go out into the civilian market and they get training on their own. Mm-hmm. But it's not going to be, it's the end users where there's really going to be a disparity. So a guy who's maybe level 1 certified, he may have, whatever. I don't have the stats in front of me anymore, but I think it's something like 8 hours of training is what he has to be able to have in order to be certified as a level 1. And then you get up, and I think for level 4 is somewhere around 160 cumulative hours. Keep in mind that 160 hours is not really counting the time that they spend on the mat on their own, or maybe their unit is doing some training, instructional. Like they go in, this is a classroom setting, they are being taught for more mat time, but still just in reference to the amount of time being taught compared to the civilian side of the house, I mean, 160 hours would be a high-level white belt, low-level blue belt in BJJ, and there's just a huge disparity. And you can the technique, and I don't say that to be mean, but it's the details just aren't there. You can tell a lot of these guys are still being taught by the numbers, so to speak, which is really just something that you do at the very early beginning level, is start teaching guys, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3. But at some point, usually right around upper level white belt, blue belt, you start instilling principles into more. If you're still following steps by the time you get to blue belt, then you're not really a very good blue belt. You should be able to see a technique that I'm demonstrating and be able to boil down the gist of it, and then be able to kind of make it your own based on your own body mechanics, your size, weight, leverage, speed, athleticism, things like that. You should be able to make refinements that suit you by the time you're blue belt. And I don't see that coming from any sort of institutionalized training. It's not just the military, it's law enforcement, it's any kind of institutionalized training. You're just not going to have that.
Yeah. So let's back up really quick. Tell me more about you and your experience.
Well, I mean, my experience is kind of all over the place. I got started in BJJ back in 2001. Prior to that, I had been involved. I was actually bodybuilding for a while. Never got into doing the whole underwear thing on stage. I just couldn't get past that part. Yeah. But, I still just did it for my own sake. I started working with a couple of private military contracting firms and doing a little bit of instruction and that led to opportunities to go and do some work with them. And then that led to some opportunities to work with the DoD and Department of State, on some projects, and that's really about it. I mean, my martial arts experience is I think I've talked about before, is in BJJ primarily, but I did grow up doing Taekwondo. I grew up doing traditional boxing. My dad was an amateur boxer. I did karate for a short period of time, gave that a try. But the vast majority of my experience is going to be in BJJ.
Cool. So you contracted for the Department of Defense and the military. Did you have military experience before?
I had some military experience, but yeah, primarily nothing that I would classify as background or anything like that. Particularly since one of the subject that we were going to be talking about was real world experience. I mean, nothing that I did in that time period equated to any sort of experience that is relevant. So I typically don't even get into that. Most of my experience came from contracting and or doing security gigs on, within the United States. So.
Yeah. So that's a good segue. So like real world experience it's like a big selling point in the reality-based self-defense community, especially if you have some sort of association with military or police. And it seems like both regular people and martial artists are really taken by that. They're very enamored when somebody has a claim to real world experience. And my question is, when you're looking at somebody who claims to teach self-defense, is there more there to be considering than just their real world experience, or is there more there than meets the eye when somebody makes a claim to that?
Well, I posed a question on Instagram years ago, and it was a kind of a poll, and the question that I asked was, would you rather train with someone who had 1,000 mock force on force experiences, or a guy who had one real world experience? And the feedback that I got was sort of all over the map. It was the vast majority of the people, when you put it to them in that way, they began to see that even a claim to, okay, I've been in a fight in a real world environment and a life or death situation, I think most people, if they're being honest, especially the guys who were actually making those sorts of claims, there's no guarantee. I need to know more information. I need to know who you fought, how you fought, what was the situation. A group of guys going in and clearing out a house, for instance, is going to be very different than you or I walking out to our car after seeing a movie. I'm not going to have additional guys in my stack to come in. In fact, one of the Army's protocols is that they need to tie up long enough for another man to come and help them or finish the fight as quickly as they can. But that's not an option for you and me. In fact, 99 times out of 100, we're probably more likely to have our death filmed and put up on YouTube than to have anybody actually intervene into that situation. So the whole thing about real world experience, there's no guarantee that there's no litmus test that the real world experience that an individual is claiming, number one, was in any way relevant to what it is that you are doing. You cleared 40 houses and did so with, an 8-man, unit. I mean, that's great. And when it comes to CQB, I'll be sure to call on you. But that has little to no reference whatsoever to combatives in my field, where 99% of the time I'm going to be alone, or worse, I'm going to be with my wife or kids who are actually going to become more of a liability than an asset. I think when you're talking about real world experience, a lot of people are making claims based on irrelevant experience that wouldn't translate to you or I anyway. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, that definitely answers my question. And the Instagram question that you posed is really interesting because, particularly more on the Krav Maga side, the actual. So there's the claim that this stuff is proven by the Israeli military, and but there's really no documentation of Israeli soldiers using most of the techniques that are taught. And each organization kind of has their own way of teaching it, but they all kind of make the same claim. And I personally find it a dubious claim that it's all battle tested and proven like 100 times over by the Israeli military. And I know even people that don't teach Krav Maga, that maybe they teach their own type of self-defense system, or they teach another big brand name of a self-defense system. A lot of times they'll say things like, "Oh, I know what works in the street because I've fought, 5, 6, 7 times. I was a doorman before. I was a security officer. I was a police officer." If you've only fought a few times, like obviously 1, 2 fights, real life self-defense situations is probably more than anyone would ever want to be in. It's more experience than most people will ever have. Does that really? Can you really make the claim that you know what works, like in general, just because you've been in a couple of scraps?
And I agree with you completely. I mean, the reality is if we're talking about a real life or death situation, the guys who learned let's be honest, you learn through things that fail. All you do when things go correctly is you just reaffirm whatever it is you already know. So if we learn at that point of failure, the people who are actually learning are the people who are losing in those life or death encounters, and they don't have any data to give us because they lost. I don't see that an individual who makes it through a couple of encounters, again, who did he fight? Because there is a vast difference between the types of individuals that we dealt with in Afghanistan, who were mostly goat herders and tribal people and stuff like that, versus the type of people that individuals, would deal with in maybe Iraq, where it was more urbanized and they did have more formalized training and stuff. Now, this is, of course, barring out, groups like Al Qaeda and stuff like that. But just from my experience, the type of guys that we dealt with in Afghanistan I dealt with harder guys in the United States bouncing than I dealt with in Afghanistan. So,
okay.
I don't see it as being a claim, okay, well, I did 3 years in Afghanistan. I don't really care. How many fights did you get in? Oh, okay, I got in 2. All right, cool. Who did you fight? Well, I've fought this one, little Haji dude and stuff. And, he wouldn't, lift up his shirt so that I could see if he had a vest on. Well, that's irrelevant. I mean, it's not, that's why I kind of make the claim that law enforcement guys really have a closer environment to what you and I would face, as far as if anybody's going to be making real world experience claims that would be relevant to us. It would be guys like bouncers, and it would be guys like law enforcement, because they oftentimes don't have that immediate backup. They oftentimes are going to be dealing with varied individuals, guys who are bigger and stronger, and then other guys who maybe aren't. They'll be dealing with intoxicated guys and very coherent guys who are very determined to commit some sort of act against you. I think their environment more closely mimics what you and I would face on a day-to-day basis with our families than some guy who did 3 years in Afghanistan and he was kicking down doors. Not to take anything away from him. When I want to learn how to kick down doors, I'll be sure to call him. But when I'm asking about self-defense, I don't see that his particular experience is relevant unless he was in some sort of specialized group where he was doing a lot of low vis work or something like that on his own. Mm-hmm. But most of the guys that I see making those real world claims are not that. You know, there were guys who did 1 or 2 deployments and stuff, and they came back, and for all I know, they were a mechanic or a cook. And I mean, I can tell you, working as a contractor, I did work in the security field in the armed capacity overseas. As many guys as there were like me, there was twice as many who worked support roles. You know, civilian contractors, guys who drove trucks, guys who did engineering work and built buildings and stuff like that. So just because somebody kind of makes a claim, well, I was a contractor. All right, well, cool. You know, we literally had a Subway on Bagram. You know, we had a Pizza Hut. You know, there were civilians working those positions. They were contractors. Yeah. So you can't just make the claim, you know, without giving more specific information.
Yeah, that equivocation is really easy to make. I think a lot of people, even if in another context they might know better, when you're talking to somebody who's maybe charismatic and they have other credentials like a Krav Maga black belt or a certification in this or that reality-based self-defense system, when they say, yeah, I have a military background, your mind automatically makes that leap and fills in what you went through. Oh man, this guy was fighting people. Like, this guy is hardcore. When very like one of my buddies, he was deployed to, I believe, Afghanistan. He's very careful about the claims he makes because he doesn't want to be one of those guys. He was a fueler over there, and I think he saw some skirmishes, shot some bullets out into the environment a couple of times, but he didn't really see. He didn't knock down doors and restrain people. He wasn't military police or anything like that. So, you know, the fights he got into were with other some other guys when you know he was on break somewhere that tried to jump him that really didn't have anything to do with his military his missions or anything. And even me, I was in contract security for 3 years, and you know, for the most part, I got really good at verbal judo, but I never had to restrain anybody. I never had to take anyone down. But if somebody who didn't really know a whole lot about contract security, I said, like, yeah, if I told them, yeah, I have a background in contract security, well, that sounds more legit than, yeah, I sat on shift for 12 hours in a corporation, or I was a mall cop or something like that.
Right.
So that's always a danger. How you use your words is always a danger, and it's definitely something that people should look out for when they're looking at somebody's resume. That could be a sign that a resume is padded. Would you agree?
I would, and it's one of the reasons actually I don't get into a lot of my background. I would rather have just more direct questions like, you know, have you ever dealt with this type of situation? Have you ever been in this? At least then I can give you my perspective based on actual experience in those particular types of environments versus sitting there and saying, well, I did this, that, and the other in this particular country. And I mean, honestly, just like you said, your imagination is going to take that and run to whatever direction, whether it be, you know, in support of my resume or whether it be in, you know, against it. So it's irrelevant. It honestly is. It's just irrelevant for the types of conversations that we're having regarding, you know, in particular, combatives and martial arts and reality-based self-defense and stuff. You know, you had said something about Israeli Krav Maga, and it was my understanding, and I'm not a Krav Maga expert or anything like that, but it was my understanding that what the Israelis had done was they kind of did their own little version of Jeet Kune Do, where they took different techniques and styles and different things from different martial arts, and they basically assembled it and then maybe added their own little spin to it and said, okay, this is going to be our system. That's fine, except that there are inherently some methodology conflicts in that. For instance, BJJ, one of the reasons why BJJ took off the way that it did was because it fought the fight in the cage in a way that no one else was prepared for at that time. They closed distance where everyone else was trying to maintain it. Now you had Wing Chun guys who could fight from, maybe 6 to 12 inches. And then you had the Taekwondo guys who could fight out to, maybe 3 feet. And, everybody had their own range based on their style, but everybody had a range. BJJ came in and even, shoot fighting for that matter, Ken Shamrock, they came in and they dominated the sport by making people fight at zero range. And when that happened, you basically took a guy's 20 years of training and just chucked it out the window because he was completely unprepared for it. Yeah. And that was then versus now. But I think that demonstrates some of the methodological conflicts when you start taking somebody who doesn't do BJJ and they look and they say, hey, that armbar, that looks cool. Let's incorporate that into our program. And let's incorporate that along with this over here, which is strictly range based and in my opinion, mostly theoretical. They try and blend it together because maybe they saw that it worked good with someone else or whatever. But it just there's conflicts in the thought process, and that translates into problems in reality because guys can never boil things down to some sort of a simplified methodology like closing distance, getting control, and when to utilize your weapon, when not to, when to throw strikes and when not to. I'm a big advocate on throwing strikes. I'm just not an advocate on throwing strikes at the wrong time. If it costs me control of my opponent. I'm a huge advocate of introducing a weapon into the fight, but you can absolutely do it in a wrong way. I just don't. Those all flow into methodology. And if you have conflicts in methodology, which I believe Krav Maga does, then it just doesn't make any sense. What you end up with is exactly what you said, where you've got some guys who are teaching it one way and you got other guys who are teaching it another way. The one thing absolutely. That you'll consistently get throughout BJJ is to close distance and gain control. That now some of the techniques within that particular methodology may differ, but all of us are going to do the same thing. We're going to close distance. We're going to get control, whether it be standing or on the ground. And then we're going to go to the ground if that's advantageous to us. But you're going to there's one consistent methodology that's very simple and it's very easy to replicate. And that's why most of the major militaries throughout the world have adopted it as the basis of their combatives, is because, quite honestly, grappling can be taught to be effective in a very short amount of time versus striking. Not to take anything away from it, but striking does take time, and it takes a lot of practice to actually get proficient at it.
Yeah, I 100%. Like, my background is in Taekwondo. I've done a little bit of everything, mostly striking arts. I do jiu-jitsu now. I have for the past few years. It's really, when I started doing jiu-jitsu, it totally turned everything I thought about self-defense upside down, because stuff that I thought was good self-defense, I realized the timing was impossible, or you could close the distance too fast. I can't knock you out on the way in. It's very unlikely. It happens in MMA every once in a while, but only by very powerful hot shots that get, have supreme timing. Like, this is not something that you can count on in a self-defense situation. Wow. And one of the things that jiu-jitsu has taught me is that if you can get into a situation where... Hey, sorry to interrupt you right in the middle of the podcast, but I promise it'll only take a second. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Combat Learning email newsletter at combatlearning.com/newsletter. Not only will you never miss an episode of the Combat Learning podcast, you'll get exclusive tips and resources straight to your inbox. And I'm giving away my ebook, An Introduction to Motor Learning for Martial Artists, so you can get up to speed on the central topics of this podcast. But that's not even it. I'll also invite you to our private Facebook discussion group so you can ask any questions you want or discuss any topic related to teaching and learning martial arts. And all of this is 100% free. So go to combatlearning.com/newsletter right now to subscribe and claim all this cool stuff for yourself. That's combatlearning.com/newsletter. You have underhooks, overhooks. You're actually in the fight for control. You have more opportunities to make mistakes and not die because you're fighting over control, and not because you're out going toe to toe. Because somebody always has a boxer's chance or a puncher's chance to knock you out when you're going toe to toe.
Sure.
And they can always, spaghetti on top of you if things go bad and then drag you to the ground. So if you can initiate that first and take away their ability to have a puncher's chance, you can start wrestling with them and using your angles and your superior knowledge of standing grappling and ground control to manage risk variables in a way that striking just absolutely can't.
I agree.
Yeah. And like, I totally agree with you. You should always be learning strikes because they're great to cover your entries into a grappling situation. They're great for covering exits out of a grappling situation. And it's really probably the most viable thing that you have if you want to try and manage more than one person attacking you at one time, to try and line them up, keep them out of range, and sort of, I guess, box your way into an escape from multiple opponents if that's available to you. Definitely, like, striking, that's one thing that striking is really, really useful for, in supplementing your grappling knowledge.
Yeah, I would agree.
So you said that, I like that you used the word environment. That's a big word in like the motor learning and control sphere, I guess you could call. In sports science, we always talk about learning environments and sports and performance environments. And when you want to have what's called specificity of transfer, that is, you want the activity, the drill, the type of practice that you're employing, you want that to transfer into the performance context. And when we're talking about a performance context outside of sport, like self-defense, then we're talking life or death. So another concept would be representativeness. So when it comes to military and police training, and I know that there's differences in these sort of environments and the dynamics that you're going to encounter between the two, would you say that experience with hand-to-hand combat in those spheres, can some of it transfer to a civilian environment? And how should you go about trying to transfer that experience in a way that is representative of what a civilian is really going to need?
Well, I mean, this again kind of comes back somewhat to that real world experience issue. All the real world experience that I gain, all that I can pass on to you is the techniques. One of the pivotal issues that's always brought up is the fact, well, you can't replicate the fear, you can't replicate the stress. Well, that's true, but I can't pass that on to you either. Mm-hmm. Nothing that I gain in that sphere can be passed on to you other than the fact that I have tested whatever it is that I've learned in a real life or death environment, and I came out in the positive. So really the only thing that I can pass off in the realm of real world experience to you is just my own verbal confidence boost that, hey, I've done this in reality and it worked. But at the end of the day, how is that any different than any other martial arts instructor out there saying, oh, well, if you do this, you can make the guy drop a lung. And if you do this, he'll die in 5 steps, or, something like that. I mean, no matter what you do, if you're a student who's coming to train with me, anything that I pass on to you, you are taking from me at my word, unless I put you into an environment where you can feel some of that stress. You can deal with some of those decisions. You can make those decisions on your own. And those are things that have to be taught gradually, and we build you up to that. And that's kind of what we do on my classes. We start out at that technique level. We start implementing gradual layers of stress, and to where eventually, by the end of the day, we're kind of cutting you loose. I mean, we put a helmet on, and it's voluntary. Not everybody wants to do the force on force portion, but the point being is that we take a day and we spend time with you from the basic level all the way up to the level where you are no longer trusting me that, hey, this is going to work because it saved my life one time. I'm going to put you in that environment, and you're going to save your own life. And that is going to have more of an impact on your confidence and your ability, as well as your ability to recall in the midst of an actual situation, because your body will recognize that stress, those stimuli. It will recognize all of those pre-attack things that we're going over. I just had a student the other day. We went through an edge weapons course. We spent some time on pre-attack indicators, and he called me up. I think it was probably a week and a half after the class, and he was like, "Yeah, I was in a store, and I saw it happen. I saw the guy come at me, and I shot in and took him down first and stuff." And he neutralized the situation. I mean, it was a guy who was intoxicated, but the point being is that he had been in that situation before, even exposed to the highest degree of stress that we could do. And in the case of his training, we were implementing shock knives and stuff like that. So there is some negative feedback, and there is some pain that he had to deal with there, as well as overcoming his own personal fears and performance anxiety in front of the group. So he's been in that situation before. His body recognized it and immediately recalled it in a real life scenario. If I had taught him that in a class, just in a typical martial arts class, conventional type martial arts, and just said, okay, well, this saved my life one time because, I did 3 tours and Nam and, whatever. None of that would have translated. None of that would have transferred. I mean, he would have that information purely on an intellectual level, but nowhere near at that deeper level that he would actually be able to recall in those moments when that fight is about to kick off.
Yeah, absolutely. That representativeness, I guess you could call it, is really important. And it is the sparring force on force scenarios where there is a controlled but real present danger of being hurt. That elicits a real adrenal response that is maybe not quite as intense or exactly the same as in a real life or death situation where you don't know if you might actually die, but is similar enough that that learning can actually transfer, especially those decision making types of skills, when to go in and how to manage somebody depending on the force that's presented to you, is crucial. And what I'm worried about for my listeners, what I want my listeners to understand that in my opinion, what you've talked about here is really a situation that's kind of open-ended. Like your force on force training, from what I've seen, what I've observed, and what you've said here, it seems like not only is it possible for you to get negative feedback, but there's a range of outcomes that could happen in the scenarios that you set up. Is that true?
Well, it's absolutely true. And one of the things that we do, the level of stress that we implement, it's got to be something that's gradually turned up. And this is where you get into actual teachers versus just what I would consider instructors, guys who are just simply repeating it because, well, that's the way I was taught. But teachers can actually see, okay, this hitting it or this guy doesn't, and they can moderate that level of progression to get to a particular end state at a particular point in time in the right way. You can absolutely do force on force wrong. You can absolutely show a guy a technique and then throw a helmet on him and be like, all right, go. And that guy, he's actually going to regress in his skill. Anything that he just wrote to the notebook, so to speak, in the back of his mind, to his subconscious, anything that he just wrote is going to go right out the window if he hasn't had some sort of gradual, progressive level of stress increase. And I've seen even, famous YouTube / Instagram guys do this to their students, where they take them and they put them in a class and teach them how to do what's called close range gunfighting. And then they literally go in there and destroy the students at the end. And by the instructor's own remarks, he says, well, I do this to them so that they will go and seek out proper combatives trainings. I'm like, why the hell did I just spend 3 days and $900 training with you then? I mean, you're throwing everything that those students spent those 3 days learning, shooting paper targets and doing all this and that. Any confidence that they may have gained in those techniques were utterly just destroyed the moment you threw a helmet on and you beat the crap out of them. And by his own admission, this is something that he does by design. This, to me, is someone who is absolutely using force on force wrong. In my opinion, he's using his students basically to stroke his own ego. But the point being is that if there's anything that I can pass on, like you had talked about the similarity that we feel in the adrenal response in actual situations, having been in actual situations before and having been in training situations, I can tell you, when I choked a dude out for real, I felt no difference than in training. In fact, I literally, as I'm choking this guy unconscious, I am thinking in my head, almost in slow motion, man, this feels just like on the mat. I literally was having those thoughts. Now, afterwards, when the auditory exclusion started wearing off and I started actually being able to hear, and there's other things that are going on around me, when that started kicking in and then everything was over and we had everything under control, at that point, then I was like, I probably could have died right there.
Yeah.
But that adrenal response, that fear, that did not happen. Not one time in any real life situation. All I remember is that anytime I was in that type of situation in a real life encounter, I remember just almost thinking in my mind in slow motion, this is just like training. And it wasn't until after the fact that you really start to rationalize, like, oh my God, that, I could have died. That's when you start having like the adrenal dump and stuff like that. And, but that's a post-fight issue. It's not a pre or even a during. At least in my experience, it never was.
My experience, I haven't been in like serious life or death situations, but I've been in situations where violence was almost certainly about to happen. And when you get that hit of fight or flight, and Rory McDonald says that the more you end up in violent situations and have to manage it, the less nervous you are going into it. But when that fight or flight hits, there is a level of dread, I think, that hits you a little bit before you go into it that disappears once you actually get into the fight. Once everything starts to go down, it's like your brain switches to a different system and you're fighting for your life. You're not necessarily like petrified with fear, unless you don't get past the fight or flight stage and you just want to run away. I think a lot of people that have never experienced violence before, maybe who didn't grow up training or have just never even been touched without their consent before. I know that a lot of women report this too before they've ever had training. Some of them even with training, that a lot of times when a man touches them, like out in the subway or something, and they weren't expecting it, like they just freeze. Like it's just, they're so petrified that they can't even move. I think that does happen to people, but if you've experienced violence before, you can kind of move into it with less of that initial dread, I guess. I don't know if you experienced that before, and you might just have so much training that it's like, I already know what to do.
Well, no, it's not so much that, if you have time to actually see it coming, if you have time to actually think about it, in those instances, 100, at that point, you're just kind of reacting. But yeah. I think the thing, I think you said it in the way that I kind of explain it to my students occurs in war with particular stem panic. It's an absence of training. Like your brain is searching for information. I've never been in this situation before. I have no idea what to do. And it's been that loop where it's asking what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know. And it's just going back and forth. And that's where you end up with that freeze.
Yeah.
That I've seen even in students, even in what to do. So they just, if you introduce them to gradual levels of stress, you can almost completely mitigate that to the point where by the end of the class, you can pretty much just tell guys, okay, shake hands and go, punching each other in the balls or anything like that. And, obviously if the guy taps, we're going to stop, or if I tell you to stop, you're going to stop. But for the most part, general safety slowly just inoculated to the stress, and they're so familiar with it that they can go, they can perform. They do have techniques that actually come back to the forefront of their mind, and they say, okay, oh, well, I remember this. And then they end up doing it. And then the confidence, like after that's over, and the guy takes the helmet off and we hot wash every situation afterwards, the confidence that the guy comes down with, like, oh my God, I actually loses. There's usually something that's highly productive that he's able to take from that, if for nothing else, just the exposure to that level of stress.
Yeah, that's big about motivational psychology and like removing any limiting beliefs or apprehensions about your training and how it applies to a real life situation. That kind of connects back to what you were saying with that instructor you talked about before, where he taught his students all this stuff, didn't really prepare them for the final sort of exercise he put them through, and then just destroyed their confidence in the training they just got. I mean, that if you just, in my opinion, if you just destroy somebody's confidence in their training and then kind of leave it open-ended, like, hey, go get real combatives training, that leaves a lot of room for apprehension, anxiety about how it applies. You're not really sure what you're supposed to do to make it apply. So if you ended up in a situation, like, you might seriously choke, like you might seriously hesitate, and you might start developing harmful and bad ideas about training, about firearm training, about combatives training, just because there's not a lot. You didn't get the proper guidance, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But that's a real, the motivation that you leave your students with, the psychological aspect is, in my opinion, almost important. Whether that's a sport context or a self-defense context, is almost as important as the regular physical training, because it's really important. If somebody is defeated mentally, if they're already apprehensive and choked up on their ability to perform, and they don't have that practice in a representative environment that actually builds them up, like you said, it could be a potentially life-threatening hole in your training.
No, absolutely. Any confidence that you instilled in that individual, let's be honest here, in this society where people freely pay you money for your training, we as instructors or teachers, we're left with this situation where, number one, I want every student to walk out of here knowing something more than they did. I want them to actually leave better than they came. But by the same token, I'm not looking to sell them a line of BS and stroke their ego like certain styles do. It's like, oh man, you just killed him right there. No, I mean, you didn't kill anybody. And chances are the instructor that you fought, he's never killed anybody either. He's standing on the foundations of somebody else, and they probably didn't kill anybody either. There's a lot of this hand-me-down BS that goes on. And I just feel that it's so much more important if you teach people correctly, they will come to those conclusions themselves. Again, going back to that original post on Instagram, this is a case where a guy comes and trains with me, and maybe by the end of class, he's had 5 mock opportunities to be in a real life or death situation, completely unscripted, against another student who also does not want to lose and does not want to die. And both guys come out of there learning something. Even the guy who loses the worst comes out of there at very least realizing that, you know what, this is a lot harder than I thought it would. I've had literally competitive IDPA and IPSC shooters come out and they're like, oh, I thought this was going to be a lot easier. And the general consensus with most people who leave the class is they never realize how difficult it is to shoot somebody who doesn't want to be shot. Yeah. It's freaking hard. And especially when you're within arm's reach of someone. And the only way to actually introduce somebody to that is to get them off of a paper flat range and put them in an environment where they can actually experience some resistance.
Yeah. That I guess unscripted would be a great term for that. To circle back to what I mentioned before, I had mentioned that I was concerned with people listening to us talking about force-on-force scenarios. A lot of people, you'll use terms that a lot of other reality-based self-defense people use, but what you mean by it is sometimes very different than what they mean. So like I was involved in a reality-based self-defense program where a scenario, a self-defense scenario was like a 90% scripted event, right? I'm reaching for what to call it. Like it was a scenario. It wasn't really sparring. It wasn't really a drill. It was an activity where there was 1 or 2 correct answers. And once you've done it, you already know how to win the drill. And the only variability there was maybe the way you used your verbal judo or something like that. So can you differentiate between what you mean in force-on-force training versus a much more scripted version of that?
What I would call what you're referring to as scenario-based training.
Okay.
So scenario-based training is in my classes, and it's more of an advanced class. It's not one that, it's one that I offer to ongoing students and not necessarily just in our 1-day or 2-day classes. But scenario-based training is where you now know how to fight. You now know how to work with all these things. And now what I'm trying to get you to do is teach you when to fight and when to break contact and when to differentiate between threat and non-threat and things like that. When people come to a class to learn combatives, the operative word that is combat. I mean, we're learning how to fight. The decision-making process is something that falls more in that realm of scenario. So, for instance, you had mentioned on your text or whatever that you wanted to talk about the spear situation. I went to spear training. I wanted to see what all the hype was about. I saw a lot of people plugging it. I wanted to just see for myself before I came to any kind of judgments on it. So, I mean, I paid a buttload of money to fly out to Vegas and to do a combatives instructor class under the Spear system. It was supposed to be just combatives instructors. I left very disappointed, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the force on force and things like that had been done in those earlier stages really were exactly more along the lines of what you're referring to, where literally what they did was they watched a video about a woman being abducted in front of an elevator. And then they put a helmet on a student and said, okay, you're the woman. And we've just taught you these techniques. Now get out of it. Well, you have removed any element of surprise. You have removed any element of decision making. And all you have really done is you've given her all the right answers of what to do. Like, as long as you do the techniques that we're showing and you use the high and mighty spear, then the instructor, who is your opponent, is going to back off on you and you're going to get out of this situation. But it is highly scripted. And that, to me, is not reality-based self-defense. Reality-based self-defense means that both players have full autonomy to act how they want to. There is no script. Now, this is, I've taken a little bit of flack for this because some guys are like, well, you should be getting more into the legality of things and you should be working more on this side. But that's not my wheelhouse. It's not that I don't understand these things or that I don't know these things. It's just not what we're doing at that particular point in the training. That's something that we reserve for down the road. In this particular force on force environment, and the force on force that we do in our class, the fight is already a foregone conclusion. You are going to be in a fight. You're going to start off, you're going to shake hands. We're going to put you in some sort of a situation. In some cases, we have you standing across from two individuals and you don't know which one is going to be initiating the contact. So that forces you to now look for things like pre-attack indicators and things like that, and then work from that. In other cases, we may start you off with your weapon hand up on the other opponent's shoulder and him doing the same to you, and we're just going to say go, and then you guys are going to fight. Because the goal is not to walk you through the decision-making process. The goal is to teach you how to fight. The decision-making process is something that is left more for scenario-based training, which is a different element, in my opinion. At least that's how we structure our classes.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And Craig Douglas has really great, I guess, a hybrid approach to that. I would call it, with his evolutions, where he takes maybe a primitive element of scenario-based training. It's not quite as complex as some scenario-based trainings are, but you have an element of you have degrees of freedom, I guess you say, with how you deal with someone in the pre-fight contact situation. And it's even possible in some situations, he's said, that some of his students have been able to end the scenario with their verbal judo, where the guys that were in the situation that were potentially aggressors decided that they just didn't want to mess with the guy because of his response. But most of them do end up devolving into situations where you have to actually fight somebody and usually pull a weapon, because just the way the scenario is based, like, hey, you just bumped somebody's truck, the two guys are walking out, they're irate at you. How are you going to manage the pre-fight space until you actually have to defend yourself? And I think that to me sounds like a really great approach that instructors could consider as well, not just separating the two and things like that. But yeah,
I don't have any issue with that at all. And I did get the opportunity to go and hang out with Craig at one of his classes and stuff, and I got to see how he did things. There's a lot of similarities that he does to what we do, and vice versa. Or actually, I probably should say a lot of similarities to what we do versus what he does, because he's been doing this for a much longer period of time.
Yeah.
but I still feel like, for instance, you take a jiu-jitsu class. When you walk into the jiu-jitsu class, you don't sit down on the mat and stretch out, and then the professor is sitting there telling you, okay, this is, you're in a parking lot and this happens and so on. I mean, that's not why you paid him. You paid him to learn how to do jiu-jitsu. You paid him to learn how to fight. Yeah. I'm leaving it up to you as a responsible adult to figure out when you need to fight. Now, in some more advanced classes, we do go over some of those things, but that's not something that I spend a lot of time doing, because to be quite honest with you, for you to pay me to teach you how to do combatives, and then the only thing that you learned was to talk your way out of a mock situation, I don't think you learned anything, because there's quite honestly going to be some situations you're not going to be able to talk yourself out of. I would rather if you came to one of my classes, I'd rather you walked away getting punched in the face at least once, than to successfully talk your way out of a mock situation that in reality you may not be able to do. So I don't want to belittle the benefits of verbal judo and learning how to navigate all that, de-escalation and all these different things. But that's not something that I quite honestly spend a lot of time on. That to me is a whole nother topic in and of itself that you could really spend a whole lot of time on, with guys who are probably a lot more qualified than I am to talk to you about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of my approach too. If I was ever to teach self-defense and I used to as an instructor before, I was like, hey, here's a couple tips on verbal judo. Here's some things you need to be aware of pre-fight, but I'm really just going to talk about the physical exchange here, because I'm not, I don't have FBI training. I'm not a police officer. I'm not, a combat physiologist or anything like that.
But again, like coming back to some of the original things that we talked about in the very beginning, law enforcement is highly equipped to talk to you about those types of things, because they are forever dealing with the intoxicated guy, the guy who's high on drugs, the guy who's pissed off because he just got in a fight with his wife, or the guy who just lost his job and, he's distraught. These guys are highly equipped to deal with that, because they literally do it day in and day out. They're given that opportunity to take the training that they've been given on an intellectual level or on a classroom level, and then they put it to work, and they're able to refine that and stuff, and then pass that stuff on to you and I. I think that's definitely a useful class to have. But I also think that in and of itself is a whole class that something could be devoted to, not just a weekend course.
Yeah. I totally agree. Sometimes I've seen self-defense programs that kind of advertise as a physical program, but like most of the contact hours are spent talking about preambles about combat physiology and how it affects your body. And then you get into like pre-fight stuff, and then you spend very little time on actually how to defend yourself. And while the pre-fight stuff is really important, I've done little seminars for like women's self-defense and stuff for things that they really need to be cognizant of when they're out running and things like that. But when somebody's coming in for self-defense, like they want to know how they can handle themselves when stuff goes sideways. So
right.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to wrap up here with two more quick questions. I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. So I kind of know what you're going to say to this, but just to be for the clarity of the listener, obviously we want an instructor who has a balance of training hours and real world experience. But in a hypothetical situation, if you had somebody with really little to no real world experience, but was an expert BJJ instructor, for example, that maybe was self-defense minded, versus a longtime soldier that's Army Combatives certified instructor, but very little outside martial arts experience, who would you, just with that information, who would you be leaning towards as hey, I know, maybe in a Bayesian logic way, this guy probably is going to be better self-defense training? Who would you think would be more able to teach you, and why?
I would need to know more about the Army individual, the military guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's got multiple years of experience, but experience doing what? Is the environment that he was operational in any way related to mine? If it was, I would need to know more about that, more than what most people are willing to put on a bio on their website. I was with this unit and I deployed this many times and stuff like that. Like, I need to know what type of situation specifically, and I'm assuming that we're talking about combatives, obviously. Mm-hmm. I need to know specifically what qualifies you, and were you ever in a situation where you had to utilize this stuff? Those would be the questions that I would be asking. And sure. And I asked that because a close friend of mine, he was with 2nd Ranger Battalion in Iraq during the height of the war. He did 2 tours, and he never once, not him nor anyone from his unit, ever had to physically put hands on an individual. Huh. So wow. You're talking about guys who were literally kicking down doors day in and day out. They never ended up in a hand-to-hand situation. So you're talking about I'm not saying that some guys don't end up in those situations. What I'm saying is just because you were there, just because you were in such and such a unit, does not mean that you were ever in a situation that is in any way similar to what I would potentially find myself in. Yeah. So I guess that's how I would have to answer it. I don't want to say I'm going to lean towards a BJJ guy or whatever. Again, one of the things I would need to know more about the BJJ guy. I mean, yeah. You said he's very self-defense oriented. Like, how so? Because I've seen some very high-level, world-class black belts show some really hokey, ridiculous stuff. Yeah. When it comes to self-defense, that to be quite honest with you, I'm somewhat embarrassed of. Mm-hmm. So it's on both sides of the line. You got guys with the real world operational experience that are padding their resumes, and you got guys without, who are literally riding the coattails from past accomplishments in somewhat unrelated fields like competitions. Not that competitions are bad, but you can't say that this guy is a 3-time gold medalist Pan Am champ. So therefore, he should teach me, how to deal with a gun or a knife. It's completely irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with what he's been training for. And I bring up guys like Jeff Glover, phenomenal BJJ guy. Yeah. But the guy literally invented this thing called the donkey guard.
The donkey, yeah.
I'm sorry, but I don't care how many tournaments you've won with that technique. That's completely irrelevant to me, unless I'm in prison. That's, that is completely irrelevant. By the same token, I don't care how many Humvees you rode in and how many IEDs you dealt with and stuff like that. I mean, those are all, noteworthy things. Got it. But none of it goes on a resume as to support you being someone that I should listen to for combatives.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer to that question. Everyone should definitely be asking more questions, which kind of leads me to my last question to tie everything together. And that's stated, just up front, kind of tying together everything we talked about. Like, what questions should somebody who wants to learn good representative self-defense, a civilian that wants to learn that, what questions should they be asking themselves when they are looking for a self-defense instructor?
To be honest with you, I think this ties into the same answer as the first question. I do not look at self-defense the same way that I did when I was a white belt. I don't look for, okay, well, what is this? What is the instructor's experience, and what is, what's his rank or whatever? I don't care about that. What I care is what he is able to actually replicate, and in particular, what he's able to actually get his students to replicate in an unscripted environment. That's what I look at. So what I want to look at, and that's one of the nice things about things like social media and stuff like that, is unfortunately on one side of the equation, you have guys with, very, very good marketing and very, very good video editing and videography and stuff, who are really kind of capitalizing on honing into people's emotions and getting them stirred up with, music and explosions and all this stuff. And then everybody looks at that and they're like, oh my God, this guy's the best instructor ever. When in reality, the actual guy who's looking hard at those things, there's nothing in there. Like, it was all scripted. You might as well have been watching a John Wick trailer. It's truly amazing. I mean, I look at that stuff and yeah, the choreography was freaking awesome, and the music and the lights, and I give that guy props, but not props for self-defense. That if anybody, and particularly around the social media side, if anybody is looking for instructors, I feel like they should kind of back off of the resume, back off of the bio, back off of all the hero worship that's going on, and look at the material that's being produced. Specifically, look at what the students are able to actually replicate. I did a video years back, and it was a student who came in who was deathly afraid of, it was an LED knife. It didn't even shock. But for whatever reason, he was deathly afraid of it. By the end of the 3-day training, he was going toe to toe, throwing elbows, throwing a guy on the ground. And what I titled the video was A Progression of Learning. That to me says more about a program than, all the video editing and music, and I don't care what the instructor's background is. And all of that is irrelevant. What I care about is what kind of product can you actually produce? What can you replicate in me? If I'm a student and signing up for your class, how can you make me better? Not how can we hang out and you tell me stories about how awesome you are, but how can you actually make me better? And the only way to do that is to show those levels of progression, to show that learning where a guy comes in, he knows nothing, and by the end, he's able to actually do something. So I don't think it's so much a case of, what questions can I ask? I think it's more a matter of sitting back and actually doing a little bit of research, spending some time looking at what guys are training, how they were able to progress, and stuff like that. If you're talking about a school that, like an actual brick and mortar school that you're training at, go in there and hang out and stuff. See what the guys are able to do, not what some mad, awesome instructor is able to do, but what his students are able to do. That's what I would look at.
Okay, great. So you made a hashtag, right? What hashtag is that?
Hashtag show your work.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really cool. Very much needed. Hey, thank you for coming on the show. This has been really awesome. Great content. And I hope I can have you on again to have discussions like this in the future.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
Guys, thank you so much for listening. If you have any feedback, you can email me at josh@combatlearning.com or send me a message on facebook.com/combatlearning. Now, real quick before I go, can I ask you a huge favor? If you got value from this episode, leave us a review on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So many shows pop up and fizzle out. And we're talking about stuff that nobody else is talking about, and we want to stick around. So leaving us a review helps us a ton. Finally, the show is produced by Micah Peacock. Thanks in advance, and I'll see you on the next episode.